Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Auschwitz was not a camp, it was a city, with numbered streets, blocks with specific functions, approved budgets, weekly reports, and signatures on every order. An administrative structure designed to destroy human beings with industrial efficiency. Most people know the gate, the numbers, the black and white photographs. This video goes inside the walls, address by address, to show exactly how this machine was built and how it operated from within. Block 11. The basement, the most feared building inside the most feared camp of the 20th century. The other prisoners of Auschwitz already lived in extreme conditions, but whoever was taken to the basement knew they had crossed a different line. Here, punishments were carried out that went beyond what any military regulation could name. And it was here that one of the most lethal decisions in history was put into practice for the first time. In the basement of Block 11, the basement, there were cells so small that it is hard to believe they were used to punish adults. The so-called standing cells measured approximately 10 square feet. 4 prisoners were pushed inside at the same time. The door closed. There was no room to sit, much less to lie down. They stood all night, and in the morning were sent to work in the camp as if nothing had happened. This could last up to 20 consecutive nights. The other type of punishment in the basement of Block 11 was even slower. The starvation cells had no window, no light, and no fresh air intake. Prisoners were locked inside without food and without water, and left there until they died. There was no deadline. There was no trial. The decision of who entered was made by the SS guards with the same bureaucracy of someone filling out a form. The prisoner's name was noted, the door closed, and it did not open again. Between Block 10 and Block 11, there was a narrow corridor that prisoners could not look at directly. At the end of this corridor stood the black wall, a wooden wall coated with material that absorbed projectiles. There, executions were carried out in silence, out of sight of the other blocks. It is estimated that more than 20,000 people were shot in that corridor during the existence of the camp. 20,000 executions in a corridor that today you can visit by buying a ticket. In August 1941, a prisoner escaped from the camp. The rule at Auschwitz was simple and brutal. For every escapee, 10 prisoners from the same block were chosen to die of starvation. This time, one of those chosen was Franciszek Gajowniczek, a man who begged to be spared because he had a wife and children waiting for him. Nobody expected anyone to stand up. Nobody expected another man to point to himself and say, "Take me in his place." The man who volunteered was named Maximilian Kolbe. He was a Polish priest, prisoner number 16670. The SS accepted the exchange. Kolbe and the other 9 were locked in the starvation cell without food or water. 2 weeks later, when the guards opened the door, Kolbe was still alive. He needed an injection to die. He was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1982. The man for whom he died survived the war and lived to the age of 93. But the detail that most visits to Auschwitz pass too quickly is this. It was exactly in Block 11, the basement, that the gas most associated with the Holocaust was tested for the first time as a weapon of mass extermination. Before that, Zyklon B was used as a pesticide. The SS knew its effects, but it had never been deliberately used to kill a large number of people in an enclosed space. September 1941, the location chosen was the basement of Block 11. On the night of September 3rd, 1941, 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 Polish prisoners, selected as sick, were taken to the basement of Block 11. The windows were sealed, the gas was introduced. The result was considered satisfactory by those in charge, fast enough, economical enough. From that point on, the method would be perfected, expanded, and industrialized. What was tested in that basement would kill more than 1 million people. The test at Block 11 convinced the Auschwitz command that they had found the method they were looking for. In the following weeks, gas chambers were built specifically for use at scale. By 1943, 4 crematoria with integrated chambers were in operation at Birkenau, about 2 miles from Block 11. At the peak of operations, in 1944, the complex was capable of murdering and cremating more than 6,000 people per day. It all started in that brick-walled basement. Today, Block 11 is open to visitors. Tourists descend to the basement, enter the standing cells, pass through the corridor of the black wall. Most leave in silence. Some cry. What is difficult to process is not the size of the place, it is the size of what was decided inside it. A brick building constructed to punish, experiment, and kill, which ended up functioning as the prototype of a system that the world is still trying to understand decades later. Block 10, the laboratory. From the outside, it looked like a building like the others. Tall windows, brick facade, the same somber architecture of the entire Auschwitz area. But the windows had special bars, reinforced opaque, so that the women inside could not see what was happening in the corridor next door. Block 10 was the medical laboratory of the camp, and Auschwitz doctors had a very particular definition of the word medicine. The name most linked to the laboratory is Karl Klauberg. A respected gynecologist before the war, Klauberg arrived at Auschwitz in 1942 with a mission approved by Himmler to develop a method of mass sterilization that could be applied without surgery, without the victim knowing, and on an industrial scale. The stated objective was to sterilize women considered racially undesirable, mainly Jewish women, without mobilizing significant medical resources. In June 1943, Klauberg wrote a letter to Himmler with the tone of a corporate efficiency report. He said that with a team of 10 people, he could sterilize up to 1,000 women per day. The letter was well received. Klauberg continued the experiments until January 1945. Klauberg's method involved injections into the female reproductive organs with substances that caused inflammation and obstruction, without anesthesia. The women were not informed of what was being done. The procedure was painful. Many had severe infections as a consequence. Klauberg kept the exact formula secret on purpose. He did not want anyone else to be able to claim the method. Horst Schumann worked in the laboratory with a different approach. He used X-ray equipment to irradiate the reproductive organs of prisoners, men and women. The dose was calculated to sterilize without killing immediately. The effects were severe burns to internal tissue and pain that could last months. Many prisoners were operated on afterward to remove the damage caused by the irradiation. The surgery was not to heal, it was to collect samples and document results. Josef Mengele did not have a fixed office in the laboratory, but he was present frequently. A doctor trained in Frankfurt, he arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943 with a specific interest in genetics. On the train arrival platform, he was often the one who made the selection. When he saw twins, he had them separated. For Mengele, twins were research material, a chance to study genetics under conditions that no university in the world would allow, even if it meant creating those conditions by force. The most documented night of Mengele's work was in March 1944. 14 pairs of Romani twins, mostly children, whom he had kept alive for research, were called to the laboratory. Dr. Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian physician forced to assist Mengele, documented what happened that night in his 1945 testimony. Mengele wanted to perform comparative autopsies on the twins' bodies at the same time. For that, he needed them to die at the same time. And that is what happened. Mengele fled in the chaos of the end of the war. He spent years in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. He was never captured. He drowned in Bertioga, Sao Paulo, in 1979. The body was buried under a false name and only identified in 1985, through dental analysis and later DNA. No court tried him. No sentence was pronounced. The survivors who waited decades for a trial never received what they asked for. Germany issued an arrest warrant that lasted 34 years without result. Klauberg's fate is even more disturbing. Captured by the Soviets in 1945 and convicted, he was returned to West Germany in 1955 as part of a diplomatic agreement. Back in the country, he went so far as to present himself as a doctor. Survivors pushed for a new trial. He was arrested again and died before the proceedings were concluded. A man who sterilized hundreds of women without consent served less than a decade of prison in total. What the laboratory represents is not just cruelty, it is the perversion of science. Doctors with legitimate degrees, trained at respected universities, used the scientific method to cause harm to human beings and called it research. The Hippocratic Oath was written so that something like this would never be repeated. The data collected in the experiments at Auschwitz were discarded by the international medical community because they were the result of crimes. The fact that we still need to remember this says something about us. Block 25, the waiting room. In Birkenau, the extermination camp about 2 miles from Auschwitz, there was a block with a function that did not appear in any official regulation. It was not work, it was not punishment, and it was not an experiment. The function of Block 25, the waiting room, was to hold women who had been sentenced to death while they waited. There was no deadline. There was no announcement. There was only the waiting. And every woman locked inside knew exactly what that waiting meant. The process began at the so-called selection, the moment when SS doctors walked through the women's blocks and chose the prisoners considered unfit for work, too sick, too weak, too old, or simply chosen by criteria that changed according to the mood of the day. The name was noted. The prisoner was informed she had been transferred. The destination was not stated, but the entire camp knew what it meant to be taken to the waiting room. Inside Block 25, the conditions were designed to accelerate the end before even the official destination. There was no food, there was no water, there was no sanitation. The women were locked together for days, sometimes more than a week, while the transport was organized. The heat in summer and the cold in winter made the waiting even heavier. Many did not arrive alive by the date of the transport. The waiting room produced deaths on its own before the announced destination. The most disturbing detail was not the absence of food or water, it was the knowledge. The women in Block 25 did not need anyone to explain what was coming. They lived in Birkenau, they knew the smell, they saw the chimneys, they had friends who had disappeared without a block transfer. Survivors from adjacent blocks describe having heard, during the night, voices from the windows, asking for water, asking for news, asking for anything that would break the silence. Several accounts mention the same request coming from the bars of Block 25. Poison. Women who knew what was waiting asked the prisoners from neighboring blocks for any substance that could end the waiting faster. Most of the time, nobody had anything to pass. Sometimes they managed to get water. The French writer Charlotte Delbo, an Auschwitz survivor, described the waiting room as the place where time stopped making sense for anyone who passed nearby. The decision of who went to Block 25 was sometimes made by SS doctors during formal inspections. But in periods of high demand, such as the mass arrival of Hungarian Jews in 1944, when more than 400,000 people passed through Auschwitz in less than 2 months, the selections were made more quickly and arbitrarily. The volume was too great for individual evaluations. The waiting room received whoever was left over, whoever did not fit, whoever the system no longer needed. There is no exact number of how many women passed through Block 25. The registration system at Auschwitz was meticulous for the prisoners who arrived, but those who went to the waiting room were frequently no longer recorded as alive. It was an administrative category, not a number. Researchers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum estimate that tens of thousands of women passed through that block between 1942 and 1945, each one with a name, a story, and a wait that lasted days. Block 25 no longer exists. The wooden structures of Birkenau deteriorated or were destroyed by the SS before the arrival of the Soviets. What remains are the outline of the terrain and some foundations, enough for researchers to identify exactly where it stood. To understand what the waiting room was, it is not the bricks that matter. It is the accounts of the women who survived in the surrounding blocks and heard, night after night, the silence broken by the bars. Block 24, the brothel. In 1943, by direct order of Heinrich Himmler, something was installed inside Auschwitz that does not appear in any concentration camp manual, a brothel. The logic was cold and bureaucratic. Himmler believed that rewards would increase the productivity of prisoners in the factories of the complex. Block 24 was built for this purpose, with regulated operation, fixed schedules, and racial rules that defined who could enter and who was excluded by law. The women forced to work in Block 24 were mostly Polish and German, largely political prisoners, common criminals, or women classified as antisocial by the regime. Jewish women could not be selected for a specific reason. Nazi racial laws prohibited relations between Jews and non-Jews. It was called Rassenschande, racial dishonor. The same laws that condemned Jews to death also excluded them from the Auschwitz brothel. The recruitment of the women was not voluntary in the common sense of the word. The prisoners were approached with a proposal: work in Block 24 in exchange for better food, superior conditions, and, the most used promise, freedom at the end of 6 months. Many accepted out of desperation. The alternative was to continue under the normal conditions of the camp, where life expectancy was measured in weeks. The promise of freedom, like almost everything in Auschwitz, was never fulfilled. The brothel operated with an organization that says a lot about how Nazism viewed everything, including this, as an administrative matter. There were fixed schedules. There was a list of prisoners authorized to visit, generally workers who had received vouchers as a reward for productivity. The time for each visit was 20 minutes, 4 to 5 men per night, 5 days per week. The women had no choice about who they received. They had no choice about anything. During the day, the women were confined inside Block 24. No outside work, no circulation through the camp. There was an SS doctor assigned to the block, not to take care of them, but to verify whether they were in condition to continue functioning. Sexually transmitted diseases were frequent and treated only when they interfered with the operation. When a woman became too sick to work, she left Block 24. Where she went, the records rarely indicated. The reality of Block 24 was not that of the promises made during recruitment. The women had no control over the conditions, had no access to adequate medical care, and did not receive the protection that the system pretended to offer. The slightly better food and the slightly superior lodging were real, but they were paid for at a price that none of the promises mentioned. And the promise of freedom at the end of 6 months was used only to maintain cooperation. None were freed. When the war ended, the women who survived Block 24 faced a second silence. Many returned to communities that had no way of understanding what had happened. There was no compensation. There was no formal recognition. In post-war West Germany, the subject was avoided for decades. The first public accounts of the concentration camp brothels only began to emerge with force in the 1990s. Most of the women died without having told their story. Block 24 is still standing. It is the first building visitors see when passing through the Arbeitsmacht-Frei Gate. The small rooms where the women work today hold archival documents. The original doors are still there, and the peepholes too. The same ones through which SS guards watched to make sure nothing went off script. The museum does not hide the building. It does not need to. It is right there at the entrance, waiting for someone to ask what happened inside. 4 blocks, 4 different systems of destruction built with an address, a number, and a regulation. But there were men in Auschwitz who did not belong to any specific block, who lived and worked in a completely different place, distant from the other prisoners by obligation and by secrecy, the Nazis called them Sonderkommando, special unit. A name that said nothing about what that work really was. They lived in the crematoria, and they knew everything. Sonderkommando. The word in German means special unit. In Auschwitz, it meant something else. It was the name given to the group of prisoners, almost all Jewish, forced to work in the crematoria and in the gas chambers. They were not volunteers. They arrived on a transport like any other, were separated on the platform and informed of their new function. Refusing meant immediate death. Accepting meant surviving for a set period, because the Nazis never intended to leave witnesses. The function of the Sonderkommando began at the arrival of the trains. They were the first faces the newcomers saw inside the camp. They directed the lines, they answered questions about where they were going, and they answered with carefully chosen lies, because the orders were clear. Nobody could know what was about to happen. A Jewish prisoner lying to another Jewish prisoner about the fate that both knew by heart. It was part of the job. It was the condition of survival. After the gas chambers were opened, the work of the Sonderkommando continued. They removed the bodies, cut the hair of the victims, extracted the gold teeth, and transported the bodies to the crematorium ovens. After cremation, they crushed the bones that had not burned completely. The ashes were discarded in the river or spread across fields. It was work of more than 8 hours per day, in shifts that rotated so that the crematoria never stopped functioning. The Sonderkommando received different conditions from the other prisoners: better rations, separate housing, access to objects from the Canada. This was not humanity, it was calculation. Better fed men work more efficiently. And there was another reason for the privileges. The turnover was programmed. The life expectancy in the Sonderkommando was about 3 months. After that, the group was eliminated and replaced by new prisoners who did not yet know what was waiting for them. What the testimonies of Sonderkommando survivors describe most frequently is not the physical horror, it is what happened to the mind. Shlomo Venezia, one of the few who survived, described the only way to continue: stop thinking, become a machine. But there were moments when that failed, when among the bodies a familiar face appeared, a neighbor and a relative, someone who had arrived on the same transport a few days earlier. In those moments, the machine stopped. Some members of the Sonderkommando refused the silence in another way. Between 1943 and 1944, while they worked, some began to write, on smuggled paper with hidden pencils, accounts of what they saw every day, names of victims, numbers, descriptions. These texts were rolled into containers and buried near the crematoria during the night. The message was always the same: someone will find this. Someone will know this happened. Someone will tell the world. The manuscripts were found in stages, the first in 1945, shortly after liberation. The last in 1980, by a forestry student working on the reforestation of the area around the crematoria. In total, 8 sets of documents written by 5 authors were recovered. Of those 5, only 1 survived the war. The others died before seeing their texts read. But the texts survived. Buried among the ashes of the crematoria, waiting, the revolt of the Sonderkommando did not come from nowhere. For months, a group of women from the Weichsel Union munitions factory smuggled small quantities of explosives into the camp. Hidden at the bottom of food containers, inside folds of clothing, each shipment was minimal. Accumulating enough took months. The contact with the Sonderkommando was made through a clandestine network. The risk for everyone was immediate death if discovered. 4 women were identified afterward and executed in January 1945. On October 7, 1944, the Sonderkommando of Crematorium 4 learned they would be eliminated that day. The original plan was a coordinated revolt across all crematoria at the same time, but time had run out. At noon, SS soldiers arrived to begin the selection of those who would be killed. The Sonderkommando attacked with what they had: axes, knives, stones, and improvised grenades made with these smuggled explosives. Crematorium I-4 was destroyed by fire. 3 SS guards were killed. The revolt was crushed the same day. Some prisoners managed to escape the camp, but were recaptured in the following hours. By the end of October 7, 1944, 452 members of the Sonderkommando had been killed, the majority after surrendering. 1 month later, the SS ended operations in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The remaining Sonderkommando was put to work dismantling the crematoria themselves, and then eliminated. Of the hundreds of members who passed through the Sonderkommando between 1942 and 1945, only a few dozen survived, most by blending in with other prisoners during the evacuation of the camp in January 1945. Some carried the silence for decades, not for lack of words, but because they knew the world would not be ready to listen. The first complete testimonies only became public in the 1980s. Some never spoke. The buried manuscripts said more than the voices managed to. What the Sonderkommando represents is one of the most difficult moral questions of the Holocaust. Men without choice, doing things that should not exist to survive a little longer, neither victims in the simple sense, nor guilty in the legal sense, a category that the world still does not have the right name to describe. The philosopher Primo Levi called it the gray zone, a place where guilt and innocence mix in a way that no court can clearly separate. Canada. That was the name prisoners gave to a set of warehouses in Birkenau. It was not an official name. It was a nickname created by the inmates themselves. Canada, for Poles and Eastern European Jews of the time, was a synonym for a distant and immensely wealthy place. A place where abundance was hard to imagine. The warehouses of Auschwitz received this name because there lay accumulated the riches stolen from 1 million murdered people. Every train that arrived at Auschwitz came loaded with people, and with belongings. The deportees had been told they were being transferred for work in the East, that they needed to bring their things, clothes, household utensils, jewelry, musical instruments, photographs, prosthetics, medicine, money, everything a family takes when it believes it is going to start life over in another place. On the arrival platform, the belongings were collected before the selection even began. Nobody would return them. Canada 2, the expanded version built in 1943, had 30 barracks. 30 large wooden structures filled from floor to ceiling with the belongings of the victims. The SS had a sorting system. Clothes were separated by type, jewelry appraised, money counted, valuables cataloged. Everything was sent to Germany, to German families, to German factories, to the treasury of the Reich. Canada was, in the language of the Nazis, an efficient economic operation. Working in Canada was considered by the prisoners one of the best positions inside the camp. The proximity to clothes and food that arrived among the deportees' belongings meant access to resources that could make the difference between surviving or not. The workers could eat, they could keep warmer clothes, they could hide small objects that could be traded. It was a position that many prisoners tried to get, and that many used to stay alive. But Canada had an irony that no privilege could erase. The workers sorted children's clothes while the chimneys of the crematoria smoked. They organized photographs of entire families that had been murdered hours before. They touched instruments belonging to people killed on the same day. One survivor described it this way: "You found everything there, the most beautiful things, and you could not eat because the smell in the air would not let you." When the Red Army began to advance in January 1945, the SS started destroying evidence. On January 23rd, 4 days before the arrival of the Soviets, Canada too was set on fire. The 30 barracks, full of clothes, fabrics, papers, and belongings of entire families, burned for 5 days. Guards watched to make sure nothing was removed before burning. The smoke was visible for miles. It was the last physical record of 1 million lives being eliminated. Even with the fire, the Soviets found enough. In Canada, the smaller version inside Auschwitz, materials remained that had not been destroyed in time. Among what was cataloged by investigators, approximately 1,760 pounds of human hair packaged for shipping, ready to be sold to German textile factories. The Nazi system maintained detailed financial records of everything that passed through Canada. Researchers who analyzed these documents found spreadsheets with the monetary value of confiscated belongings, clothes sent to German families, gold deposited at the Reichsbank, coins cataloged by origin. The total calculation is impossible to pin down, but conservative estimates speak of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's values, taken from the suitcases of victims, without leaving a receipt. The name Canada survived the war as one of the most disturbing details of the internal language of Auschwitz. Prisoners naming the place of stolen wealth after a land that represented hope. The warehouse is burned. The objects are gone. But the list of what was confiscated still exists in the archives. And to each item on that list corresponds a person who placed that thing inside a suitcase believing they would see it again. That belief was the last thing many had. Block 4. The Forbidden Room. Inside the Auschwitz Museum, there is a room that visitors enter in silence and leave unable to speak. It is not the largest. It is not the most elaborate. It is simply a long corridor with a glass wall. And on the other side of the glass, there is human hair, nearly 2 tons piled up behind the glass. The reason why photographing this room is prohibited to this day is one alone. The museum understands that turning that into an image for sharing would be reducing victims to content. The 2 tons of hair in Block 4, the Forbidden Room, represent approximately 40,000 people. But that number is not the total. It is what was left when the Soviets arrived. The rest had already been packaged and sent to German factories, where it was used in the production of industrial textiles and submarine seals. The price paid to the SS was 50 pfennigs per kilogram. In seized documents, investigators found receipts. The system recorded everything, including this. In the same block, behind another glass, there's a pile of shoes, 25,000 pairs, a number that seems large until you discover the context. 25,000 pairs represent approximately a single day of operation of the camp during its peak period. One day. In the summer of 1944, during the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews, up to 6 trains per day arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, each train with hundreds of people. The shoes stayed, the people did not. The Forbidden Room displays other objects beyond the hair and the shoes: eyeglasses, canes, limb prosthetics, toothbrushes, aluminum pots with screw-on lids, the kind used to carry food on a long journey. Each object says the same thing: their owners intended to use it again. They had a destination in mind. They had made plans for a life that included that specific object. Block 4 is the most silent and most devastating archive of plans that were never fulfilled. Block 4 also displays cans of Zyklon B, the gas tested in Block 11 in 1941 and later used in the crematoria of Birkenau. The original cans, metal cylinders with labels from the producing company, Degesch, are displayed behind glass. The company continued to exist after the war. The product itself, a pesticide based on hydrogen cyanide, continues to be manufactured in modified versions for agricultural use. The name was changed. The basic formula remained. The labels changed. The prohibition on photographing the hair room in Block 4 is one of the few absolute rules of the Auschwitz Museum. No camera, no cell phone. The museum's management explains the decision with logic that is hard to counter, that hair belonged to real people, with real names, whose death was a crime. Turning it into an image to be shared on social media would be a way of reducing victims to content. Some things should not have a hashtag. The museum decided this is one of them. There's a difference between knowing the Holocaust happened and standing in Block 4 looking at the hair behind the glass, a difference that no book can replicate. The museum receives more than 2 million visitors per year. Most leave different from how they entered. Not with answers, but with questions that do not leave the mind. How was it possible? How did we get here? How do we make sure it does not happen again? The Forbidden Room does not answer any of them. It only makes them hurt more. The orchestra. There was a sound in Auschwitz that survivors describe as one of the most difficult to process after the war. Music, not music coming from far away. Live music performed by prisoners inside the camp while everything else was happening. Auschwitz had orchestras, not one, 6. And the story of why they existed, what they played, and what it cost the musicians to do it says as much about Nazism as any other aspect of this camp. In 1941, the commandant of Auschwitz ordered the formation of a prisoner band. The idea was not new. Other SS had done the same in other camps. The initial logic was simple. Military music helped keep the prisoners in cadence when leaving and returning from work, making counting easier. But over time, the function of the orchestras grew, changed, accumulated meanings that nobody at the beginning had planned. Or perhaps some had planned from the start. At the peak of the complex, there were up to 6 different orchestras inside Auschwitz. One in the main camp, with up to 120 musicians, one in the women's camp at Birkenau, one in the men's camp at Birkenau, one in the Romani camp, one in the Theresienstadt camp, and one in Monowitz, the industrial area. The musicians were selected on the train arrival platform. Separated from the death line by one detail, they knew how to play an instrument. The SS officers had practical reasons for maintaining the orchestras. Military music at work departures and returns facilitated control of the columns, but there were less confessable reasons. High-ranking officers enjoyed classical music and wanted concerts. They wanted entertainment. The Auschwitz of administrative reports was a labor camp. The Auschwitz of Sunday afternoons, for those on the right side of the wire, was a place with live performances of Beethoven and Schubert. The repertoire of the orchestras included everything: German military marches, popular music of the era, operetta melodies, and classical pieces. The main camp orchestra performed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony at Sunday concerts. The programs were defined by the preferences of the commandants. Instruments and sheet music came from the deportees' belongings. The same instruments cataloged in Canada, taken from the warehouses directly to the rehearsals of the following week. One of the functions of the orchestras was to play at the arrival of the trains. Not always, but frequently enough to appear repeatedly in survivor testimonies. The deportees stepped down after days of travel, exhausted with children in their arms. And they heard music, cheerful melodies, lively marches. The idea was to create an impression of normalcy, that this was a transfer to a labor camp, not the end of the line. That impression lasted until the selection began on the platform. On Sundays, the orchestras performed for the SS personnel and their families. The survivor, Fania Fenelon, a member of the women's orchestra at Birkenau, described a scene she could not get out of her head. Officers arrived at the Sunday concert directly from the selection. They sat down, they listened to Mozart, they applauded, and they went back to work. The interval between one thing and the other was less than an hour. The women's orchestra at Birkenau was founded in 1943 under the direction of Alma Rose, an Austrian violinist and niece of the composer Gustav Mahler. Alma transformed an amateur ensemble into an orchestra that the SS officers themselves considered professional level. She knew that the quality of the performances was what kept the musicians and the musicians alive. Alma died at Auschwitz in April 1944, possibly poisoned. It was never properly investigated. Being a musician at Auschwitz gave privileges: separate housing, better rations, exemption from the heaviest forced labor. But there was a cost that no privilege compensated. The musicians had to play while watching columns march to jobs from which many would not return. They had to keep the rhythm during executions in the yard. They had to appear normal. The dissonance between what they played and what they saw was what destroyed most of them from the inside. Many called it torture disguised as luck. The death rate among the musicians was the second highest in the camp, surpassed only by that of the Sonderkommando. Researchers attribute the number to a specific cause. The musicians had total awareness of what was happening, but needed to maintain their sensitivity to play. Unlike the Sonderkommando, who tried to disconnect emotionally, the musicians could not do that. Music demanded feeling. And feeling in that context was unbearable for most. Anita Lasker-Wallfish was a cellist in the women's orchestra at Birkenau from 1943 to 1944. She survived. In 2025, at 99 years old, she was the last known survivor of the Auschwitz orchestras. In decades of interviews, she repeated the same phrase, "The cello saved me," but never without what came after. Saved by music inside a place designed to kill people like me. There is a limit to how much that makes sense, and she reached that limit every day for more than 80 years. What the orchestras of Auschwitz reveal is not just cruelty with aesthetics, it is something more disturbing. The human capacity to separate the beautiful from the monstrous, and make both function at the same time, in the same place, with the same efficiency. The same ears that appreciated Schubert on Sundays made life and death decisions on Mondays, and the music continued. That is what the survivors say they could never explain to anyone who was not there. After the war, many surviving musicians remained silent for years, not because they lacked words, but because the question that always came, how did you play knowing what was happening, had no answer the world was prepared to hear. Playing was surviving. Surviving was guilt, and the guilt of having survived through music inside that camp was carried by most until the end of their lives. Some called it the second prison. Auschwitz was not an accident. It was not the madness of a few. It was a system with addresses, block numbers, approved budgets, written regulations, and signatures on every document. The basement, the laboratory, the waiting room, the brothel, the Canada, the Sonderkommando, the orchestra. Each one was a cog in a machine that functioned with efficiency to murder thousands of people. Remembering is not optional. It is the only thing we can still do for the victims, and the only thing that can prevent it from happening again.